moving on to the 12-mark question. So let's have a shot at this. Discuss the likely success of the European Central Bank's quantitative easing. So the success of the European Central Bank's quantitative easing program in moving the Eurozone inflation closer to 2%, basically. Okay, first thing I'm going to do here is have a reread of this, because this basically tells us how successful it was. And remember, so these figures 100% would be using a lot of these here. So extend 60 billion monthly. The scheme has already been through 1.1 trillion of QE. We are doing more because it works, so the scheme is going to continue since it worked. That sounds pretty good and pretty valuable to use. Also, there's a bit more towards the end. Okay, and here, so the question's asking, has QE been successful in raising the Eurozone inflation rate, basically? And this says, via predictions, by just 1% in 2016 and 1.6%, and we're getting towards that 2% ceiling, which is what we want to do, and so it means it is working. Okay, so this is how I would answer it. I would start by just defining two key terms, so quantitative easing, interest rates, whatever you want to define, whatever works. And then for my paragraph, I would go about saying, I believe it is a success, so the quantitative easing program is a success. As inflation is getting closer to the 2% ceiling, then I would say, for example, this is shown as, I would quote this extract and just say basically it's getting closer to 2% as it's expected to be 1.6% in 2017. Then I would go about saying, because I want to use, remember this is 12-mark question, you want to have the application in there, and I'd go about using these two stats. The Eurozone has undergone extensive quantitative easing program, with it being 1.1 trillion originally, and it's agreed to extend it 60 billion. And the reason why they have agreed to extend it 60 billion, and the reason why they are continuing it, and then I would basically go on to explain what quantitative easing is and the method of quantitative easing. So central bank creates new money. So when central banks creates new money, they buy government bonds plus assets from banks. What does this do? This increases banks, and this is a really good key term, liquidity. And you may have revised a ratio like liquidity ratios, things like that. And if banks have more liquidity, what does it mean? It means they can lend more money, and that's the main quantitative easing bit, basically. So central bank creates new money electronically, and they use that to buy basically banks' assets, banks' bonds. This increases banks' liquidity, which increases their ability to lend more money. And then you can basically link it to anything, saying that you can link it to interest rates, or you can just say, if banks can lend more money, they have more liquidity, it means that it's easier for consumers to gain loans, it's easier for the firms to gain loans, meaning that it increases consumption, increases investment in the economy, and then it's just a classic chain of analysis. Increase consumption, increase investment, therefore it's going to, consumption is about 60% of AD, thus shift AD out. When AD shifts out, it's going to cause, and 100% draw the diagram here, LRS, whatever you want. I would draw LRS here, why instead of SRS, since LRS is easier to evaluate, and of course there are big evaluation marks here. So when we use quantitative easing, it is going to cause AD to shift out to AD1 due to the increase in consumption and investment, therefore causing price levels to increase from PLE to PL1. And what type of inflation is that? That is demand pull inflation. And then another side effect you can talk about, if we look at the diagram again, so we've seen AD shifted out, we've talked about price level, but if we look at the other axis, which is real GDP and price level, obviously here, real GDP has increased from YE to now Y1. How does that affect the economy? How does that affect the Eurozone? If real GDP is increasing massively, well, if your real GDP is increasing, the main thing it's going to affect is investor consumer confidence. The consumers seeing the economy is growing. It's another positive signal. It can lead to things like multiplier effects. But the main thing is a positive sign. Therefore, if it shows the economy is doing well, and if the economy is doing well, it means confidence will be high. And if confidence is high, it maintains at high levels of consumption, maintains at high levels of investment in the economy. So it's another positive effect of quantitative easing. And how would you evaluate this? I would again just go back to the extract, have a read of this, and try to think of an evaluation point from this extract. But first thing, I underlined this earlier, we're doing more because it works. They said they're extending the QE program a further 6 months, but this shows, you see how in evaluation, the original massive QE scheme didn't do the job, did it? That's why they're having to extend it. So the initial period is having to be extended, since it did not achieve the goal of meeting that 2% inflation rate. So that's definitely a good evaluation point there. And then towards the end, a great evaluation point here, the Dagri, or whatever his name is, Mr. Dagri basically says that monetary policy alone, which is just quantitative easing, interest rates, cannot restore the Eurozone's inflation. We need to use other policies like fiscal policy, basically. And yeah, that's a really good evaluation point. So, however, in evaluation, this depends on the use or the effective use of other policies to therefore restore the Eurozone's inflation. And of course, it's a very general point about quantitative easing with regards to evaluation. It's just time lag. It takes time for this money to be translated into the economy. We say generally it takes 12 to 18 months for any economic policy to actually show some effects, show some fruition in the economy. So for example, if this quantitative easing program has just happened now, we have to wait at least 18 months to see any effects of this quantitative easing. So you could say, however, this depends on the time lag, and then explain what I just said. There are lots of evaluation points there. You can think of a few for yourself as well. But a lot of the marks here, I think it's quite a decent 12-mark question. A lot of the marks here will just be that step-by-step chain of analysis, making sure, firstly, use enough application, explain quantitative easing in relevant detail, and then decent evaluation points. And that should be enough for 12 out of 12 on that question.